I'm continuing my look back at past games between Sergei Karjakin and Magnus Carlsen before their World Championship match in November. And, well, they first played in 2005 when they were in their early teens. And they played many classical games against each other over the next few years, but they're all very hard fought, and they all ended in draws. Well, until this game in 2010, 5 years after their first classical game that they played against each other. As you can see, it's a French defence. Carlsen playing with the black pieces. A little bit unusual to see Carlsen playing French, but, well, as he said, he was desperate to win this game and wanted to do something just a little bit different. He also says that he believes that e5 and c5 are basically the two correct responses for black against e4, staking a claim in the centre. And he thinks that the French is perhaps even slightly dubious. Of course, he's talking on a very high level. But he does play it now and again. And let's have a look at the position they've reached. So Carlsen's played the classical French with knight 3, knight f6. He really thinks that bishop b4 is a bit too controversial, giving up the bishops at too early a stage. But the classical variation is more him. And we have a typical position on the board where there's been an exchange of pawns on d4, or between c5 and d4, and Karjakin has the blockading bishop on d4. Very important that white blockades the pawn on d5, restricting the bishop on b7. And there have been many beautiful classical games where white ends up with a blockading knight on d4, blockading the pawn on d5 and restricting that bad French bishop on b7. And you could say that is one of the big themes of this game, actually. Can white maintain that blockade on d4? The moment everything is secure, but white also has to be very careful about the f6 pawn break, breaking down white's centre and getting some play on the f-file, and we'll see that in a second. And Carlsen thought after the game that in fact white should play solidly here, putting the queen on f2, supporting the bishop. The queen might end up on d4 after the exchange. It also might just end up on e3, supporting e5, or maybe after an exchange on f6, looking at the pawn on e6. But instead Karjakin played queen h4, and Carlsen, in his notes to this game for ChessBase, thought that queen h4 was actually a bit of a mistake because the queen is a little bit offside. Carlsen exchanged on d4 and played f6. And then bishop d3. Carlsen also didn't like that one as well, probably because it means the rook can't easily retreat down the d file. Threatening something on h7. Whoops, misfired. So h6. And here, really, white has to exchange on f6. There's simply too much pressure on e5. So the exchange. And now we can see some of the problems that white is encountering here, and that these rooks are now split. Not good. Rooks like to work together. And okay, let's see what happens if white makes a normal move. Well, first of all, you can see that there could well be a problem for white here because of the pressure on f4 and potential pin on the f-file, so that moves like e5, sometimes even g5, whoops, g5, become possible to exploit that pin. For example, after rook g1, rook f8, hitting this pawn, and after knight e2, then simply e5. Well, there's no pin, but after this exchange, then black's rooks are coordinated, could well come down to f2, although white is still blockading on d4. The rooks, just a split, look very poor. And this knight on e5 is flying around. It might just trade on d3, sometimes come to c4. I mean, this is a lovely position for black. So because of that, Karjakin played, after the trade here, he played f5. Okay, this looks sensible. If black has to trade, then that will solve a lot of white's problems. But rook f8, exploiting the pin, and then the rook came to g1. And here's a very interesting moment in the game. I'm sure that many people in this position would be tempted simply to win material. e5 looks extremely strong. Obviously, if the rook moves to the side, then these pawns just stomp down the board. But I'm sure it's Karjakin's idea to give up the exchange like this, because the rook is trapped. Of course, he would have seen this. But this is not so clear. Let's say after queen e4 and rook e1. So this pawn, supported by the bishop, blocks out these rooks. There's a nice blockade on e4. There's even a bit of pressure here. And you can see that white is very well coordinated. The bishop is superbly placed, supported by the pawn on c2. Very hard to make progress for black here. I mean, black obviously is the one trying to win. He's the exchange up, but I think very difficult. But instead of that very tempting move e5, Carlsen just played knight c5. I think that shows very good judgment, even though, you know, he's desperate to win this game, but declines to take the material. But now black is getting close to either playing e5 or taking on f5, because, well, there's a simple threat to take on d3 and take on f5. So white has to exchange. And knight e6, attacking the blockading rook. And here Carlsen thought that white should take on d5. There's a very, very sweet tactic here. Just look what happens. So knight f4. Rook is still in trouble. Rook d4, and now queen c5. And amazingly, that rook can't move. It's in big trouble. So, for example, after c3, then black wins with this tactic, queen takes, and rook f1 mate. I mean, this is superb calculation from Carlsen to see that after queen c5, basically white is in big trouble. But still, he thinks that this could be white's best way of playing the position, just to give up the exchange, and because the bishop is very well protected, also controls the f1 square, this might be white's best chance to make a draw and obviously move the queen away. But instead, Karjakin tried to keep hold of everything. Rook g4. But you can see that black is so active now, and also getting very close to opening up the long diagonal for bishop. This bishop waiting in the wings is one of the big themes of this game. Queen g3 played. And now Carlsen says that after queen e7, he says this is the last key move in the game. He says the point is to control e2, to prevent this knight swinging around, maybe blockading on d4. And, well, it just means that after d4, this knight doesn't really have a good square to go to. And there are some really nice variations that Carlsen pointed out after the game. Well, h3 looks like a very natural move to give the king some room here. But you can see how powerful this move d4 is. Take a look at this. Well, after knight e2, well, one shouldn't take this immediately because of rook g7 check, but instead bishop c8 wins in exchange, because this is on and that is on, and it's too much. So after d4, what else have we got? We've got knight d1, and again bishop c8 is awkward. Rook attacks the queen. Queen to the side. Rook moves away. And now the bishop comes back to the long diagonal, threatening here. And knight takes g2. And Carlsen just says, well, white simply can't coordinate, and there's no decent defence to this check. And this is an utter disaster for white. I mean, look at these pieces. They're miles from anywhere sensible. Really nice variation. And one last variation: if rook e1, then this can be taken, and you take here, and this is simply too much for white. Rook f1 check threatened, and yeah, black wins this position. Therefore, in this position, Karjakin decided to give up the exchange, but in this case, it's just not enough, because Carlsen is able to exchange off all the heavy pieces, and that makes life very easy. Or, for example, after h3, then once again this key move d4, opening up the bishop's diagonal, and this is completely winning for black. Karjakin tried knight d4. Okay, this is a wonderful blockading piece, and now it's going to take longer for the bishop to enter the game, but the problem is that black is able to trade queens, and in that case it's only a matter of time before black is able to worm his way in, and Carlsen's technique was, of course, perfect. So bishop activating, just restricting white's pieces, and now black's king comes in. I mean, black, there are so many ways. It's just a case of finding a route in for the rook. Once the rook comes in and the king, then it's over. So white has to pay attention to this. That's one thing. And now you can see that the king is cut. The king can't make it over. Okay, black has to step back for the moment, but watch what happens. So the king comes back. This pawn prevents a knight to come blockading here. And now it's just a case of undermining the knight support on d4. So black simply wants to play b4 here, undermining the knight and creating a weakness on the queen side. And then because the king can't run across two sides of the board, it's very easy. And here, well, Karjakin cracks completely because he just allows the king to come in, and then king e3 and possibly rook f2 check, or maybe the king just comes in here. But in any case, white is completely lost in this position. So fabulous strategic game from Carlsen. In some ways this rather reminds me of a game, the first game I looked at in this preview, a rapid play game where Karjakin had the black side of a Najdorf and the centre pawns were blockaded, and indeed Carlsen's rooks were misplaced somehow on the d file, or they couldn't control the d5 square and the c file, and it's the same in this game. Very, very similar. That when it came to this position, well, the blockade of the dark squares unfortunately means that white really can't control the play on the f file, and the rooks are split. Very, very similar games in some ways. This was Carlsen's first classical win against Karjakin. They'd made draws up to this point. And this was a crucial game for the tournament. After this, Carlsen went on to win the tournament in Vaikonze with 8.5 out of 13. Karjakin only got 7. And you can see at this stage, in 2010, Karjakin's rating was only 27.20, whereas Carlsen had leapt ahead with 28.10. And in fact, his victory in Vaikonze in 2010 basically shot him to number 1 in the rating list. So at this point, there was a clear gap emerging between the two players.